My name is Dr. Gary Schnell, and I'd like to welcome you into my home once again, where I'm doing a series of YouTube videos in an effort to highlight different chapters of my recently published book, Consciousness, All in One and One in All. Today I'm going to be skipping over chapter 9 of my book, since it is mostly a summary of the previous chapter. And I'm going to be going on into chapter 10, which is about psychic phenomena. So we're moving from a monistic theory of consciousness into psychic phenomena, where historically, from a classical physics or a Newtonian physics standpoint, psychic phenomena would either be marginalized as lies or mistakes, or they would be denied because such phenomena can't be explained at all using classical Newtonian physics. Now, in this book, we've been talking about quantum physics, where we have such things as non-locality, entanglement, uncertainty, and we also have probabilities. So while there isn't a specific theory to explain how we can have any psychic phenomena exist, we at least have a theory now that allows for the possibility without calling them miracles or feeling that the people that are reporting them are histrionic or mistaken or lying. Now, we've all heard stories about macropsychokinesis. Macropsychokinesis. It's the movement of large bodies using the mind. And we've heard such stories probably from the standpoint of the 100-pound mother who lifts a 2-ton car off of her son after an accident. And, such things have been reported. In the 1800s and early 1900s, there were all kinds of reports of macropsychokinesis, which were largely fraudulent, and people developed a cottage industry on proving these things to be fraudulent, but there were some that they couldn't disprove. There were also reports of other psychic phenomena that largely were exhaustively looked at in this book by Kelly and Kelly called Irreducible Mind. You can see by this book that they probably did a pretty exhaustive job, and indeed they did. So what we've got is psychic phenomena that have no teeth. And so a couple of people decided that they would start to do studies. A fellow named Rhine and a fellow named Zener. And they developed what have become known as Zener cards, Z-E-N-E-R. Zener cards are 25 cards made up of 5 different symbols and 5 different colors. And the idea is for the person to guess what card is being held by the person that's doing the examination. This is what we refer to as telepathy. And amazingly, there were a number of different people that had higher guess rates than would be expected. There was one fella named Hubert Pierce who in different studies had anywhere from a 47% to a 53% guess rate. with odds against of being up to 22 billion to 1. Now, there is some sense that perhaps people who do better with these kinds of things may be gifted. Otherwise, are they cheating? Well, people decided that they were going to do more and more to make these studies legit. And every time they answered the questions of the physicalists, who of course insisted that these things were bogus, the goalposts would be moved and they'd have to repeat their studies and repeat their studies again and again. But at any rate, the mantle was picked up by others, including a fellow named Honorton, who developed something called a Ganzfield technique. Now, what the Ganzfield technique involves, it involves sitting relaxation for 30 minutes, and then every effort in the world is made to take out extraneous stimuli like noise-canceling headphones or pads over the eyes or anything that will reduce incoming stimulus. And then a sender is given 4 cards and views one of those cards, and a receiver who is across the street in another building is to tell which card was chosen. And indeed, what they found on when they did these studies, this hit rates up to 33%, when they should be, as you can guess, 1 out of 4 cards, no more than 25%. And the odds against such a finding are 1 billion to 1. They refined these techniques. They used ways of minimizing the potential for they shielded the person that was receiving, so that they were ruling out electromagnetic transmission. They also had to prove that the person in the one building wasn't running over to the other building. It got really strange. But as I say, these studies went on and are probably the most thoroughly, probably have the most thorough rigor of any scientific studies that have been done over time, just because they've had to address moving of the goalposts so frequently. Now, in medicine, we have our share of what might be referred to as psychic phenomena as well. We have something called psychoneuroimmunology. Psychoneuroimmunology, believe it or not, that's all one word. And what this involves is the idea that stress is immunosuppressive. And what happens with stress is we kick out a lot of cortisol from our adrenal glands. And the cortisol has a number of effects on different areas of our brain, including the amygdala and the hippocampus. And it also has the effect of increasing blood sugar as we gear up for a fight or flight response. So what we've been able to look at is the idea that stress causes things like ulcers. It causes things like sudden death, sudden heart attacks, voodoo death. It can cause skin problems. It can worsen things like psoriasis. So we know that stress has a number of physical ways. Again, we're converting something that is psychological into something that is physical. So the psychology has a number of physical ways of coming out. elevated blood pressure, strokes. These are things that can be intensified by stress. And then on the other side of it, the positivity of relaxation. A doctor named Herbert Benson wrote the relaxation response in the later 1990s. And indeed, we can find that people's blood pressures lowered. They are less likely to have a variety of physical ailments. They are more likely to be able to ward off illnesses. And that's all because they have a more positive, less stressful viewpoint. Now that brings us to the placebo response. The placebo response is a positive medical outcome with no more than the use of a chemically inert substance. It's been used since the 1700s, largely to treat pain because it does cause the release of endorphins, the runner's high, the neurotransmitters involved in pain management. But we also have learned that the placebo response is active in a number of medical, biological functions. Now, it is dependent on expectations. And the expectations of the person receiving the placebo depend on suggestibility, motivation, and symptom focus. So here we have psychological phenomena, expectation, suggestibility, symptom focus, motivation, all playing a part on the release of physical neurotransmitters to manage a physical symptom. So again, a psychic phenomenon, if you will, where the mind is interacting with the body. Now, the history of the use of the placebo from the 1700s on up until 1962 was little regulation. We used it when we thought it might be helpful. But then in 1962, Congress passed a law regarding placebos, regarding our ability to use placebos freely, and regarding largely and most significantly the pharmaceuticals' necessity to separate the efficacy of their medicines from the placebo response. In other words, the pharmacology businesses had to display a response over and above the placebo response on a consistent basis. The problem with that was, from a historical standpoint in this country, is that it demonized the placebo response. We are used to in this country a physical illness responding to a physical pill. And so from a medical and a doctor's standpoint, and from pharmacology's standpoint, boy, this sure complicated things. It was not something that a lot of people wanted because of the complications. But we're adding a psychological factor here. And I think a lot of doctors learn to read out the placebo response issues from the journals that they were reading. And the placebo responders, or the people who were perhaps more suggestible, well, they became problematic, just like the the placebo did. These were people that we looked at as being more suggestible, because 35% of the population is more suggestible. These are people we thought were more histrionic, because typically suggestible people are histrionic. Now, those can both be pejorative terms in today's medicine. But what ends up happening is, we miss the boat on a lot of things. One of the things we miss the boat on is, are there people that are more susceptible to the placebo response? What is it that makes them more susceptible to the placebo response? Are there conditions under which the placebo response might be more positive? For example, we know that the bigger the placebo, the bigger the response. If you give 2 placebos instead of 1, the 2 placebos will have a better response than the 1 placebo. So what are some of the things that we can use to impact positively on the people with whom we're working? That is now, something that is being looked into. Is it simply gifted people like Hubert Pierce, or are there other things that we can tap into? The other thing that wasn't realized until more recently, and fortunately it has been realized more recently, is that doctors are part of the placebo response. The better the relationship between a doctor and the person with whom he's working or with whom she's working, the better the outcome is likely to be. And unfortunately, we as doctors aren't taught a lot about those types of things. Empathy is something that's taken for granted in medical school, and it's not something that you learn on the fly. And so let's hope that as time goes on, we can have a better appreciation for the placebo response and what we can do from a training standpoint to enhance our relationships with our patients. Next, we come to hypnosis. Now, hypnosis also depends on suggestibility and expectation. But in between there is something that we call focused attention. And that's the area where there's been a lot of confusion when it comes to hypnosis. People aren't asleep when they're hypnotized like we have commonly thought. People are attending to in a very focused fashion to the person doing the induction. And that's what's happening during hypnosis. And again, we have found, this psychological phenomenon where we have expectations and suggestibility that is having a positive impact on physical well-being. We use it for burn patients. We use it for pain in general. Burn pain being, I think, the most intense pain there probably is. We use it for the pain that mothers in childbirth, and they might argue with what the most intense pain is, the pain that mothers in childbirth experience. We use it to decrease the bleeding in hemophiliacs. We use it to decrease bleeding post-surgically. In my field of child psychiatry, we have something that we call hypnotherapy, where we use it to treat PTSD. We use it to treat depression and anxiety. We use it to treat compulsions like cigarette use and gambling. So hypnosis is another one of those elements, one of those topics that in a medical field is basically a psychic phenomenon. Now, to this point, I've indicated that Kelly and Kelly, did an exhaustive study on psychic phenomena. We've looked at, things that from a medical standpoint are psychic phenomena. We've looked at things like telepathy and micro and macro psychokinesis. And yet we don't have a theory now. At least to this point, we can say that we don't have to ignore or deny these kinds of things like we used to have to before we understood something about quantum physics. Classical physics just doesn't have an explanation for these kinds of things, and they minimize or deny these kinds of phenomena. But at least using or with some understanding of quantum physics, we can wonder about whether quantum physics will allow for such phenomena and might be where some of the explanation lies, and we can pursue studies, hopefully from a scientific standpoint, in addition to the ones that were done in the lab by people like Ryan and Zener and Honorton, and perhaps we can find some medical and neurological phenomena that play the mediator between the psychological and the relief of pain, or between the sender and the receiver. So that's ongoing at this point, and I think that it requires us to take a look more carefully at these things. Now, there was the beginnings of a theory, and it was started by a psychoanalyst, Dr. Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, in her book, Extraordinary Knowing. Now, she tells the story in this book of the loss of her daughter's harp, very expensive harp. She exhausted all means of finding this harp, to the point where, almost as a joke, she contacted a dowser. Now, a dowser is someone who divines the location of objects. Most typically would divine the location of water so that a well can be sunk. And these were things that were done back into the 1800s and probably before that, for all I know. But anyway, there are people that do dowsing, and this dowser divined the longitude and latitude of the coordinates of where this harp might be, and 2 days later, indeed, they found the harp. Now, Dr. Mayer thought this was pretty astounding, and decided she was going to look into this further, and that she did. She wrote a book describing her incident, and included in that book many of the things that Kelly and Kelly had included in their exhaustive examination of psychic phenomena. And with that information, and with the work of the collaboration with a couple of physicists, she came to a model. It's called the M5 model. Now, the M5 model involves mind and matter. Mind is divided into the conscious, explicit elements, the narrative, the ego, the default mode network, which is the MRI designation, I guess, for ego, or it's synonymous with the ego. And down here we have the unconscious, the big part of the consciousness of a person, where all of the information that doesn't make it to awareness, but that informs awareness, where all of that information is in cells and muscles and other areas of the brain. And then up here we have matter, over here we have matter. Up here we have the classical physics concept of matter, or what we see in our day-to-day lives, because what we see is the classical physics movement of matter. And then we have the intangible quantum physics, the things we can't see and that didn't have any appreciation of until the early 1900s. So what is thought might happen is that all of these things go along in their own quadrants. Of course, there's no lines separating anything, but that in this area in here, as we dip into the quantum physics and into the unconscious, this might be the area where we have the beginnings, what I've called anomalous, or what she called anomalous, the beginnings of psychic phenomena. So that you have this chemical substance, a placebo. It somehow, we don't know how, through the mind, involves an experience of less pain. On the other side of the tangible, we have the conscious experience of less pain. And it goes through this kind of a pathway involving quantum physics and our unconscious. So that was her model. And we will be using that model further in this book as I expand on that model in some interesting, what I think are some interesting ways. So let's recap from maybe the first chapter of the book, where we started talking about the narrative and the development of the narrative from a bottom-up perspective that essentially involves our ego, our default mode network. And the essence of the ego is a sense of separation one from another. Now, that is all what is going on from a developmental standpoint, and continues to go on through much of our lives. But then we have these people who might be gifted, like Hubert Pierce, or maybe these people who are suggestible and more likely amenable to a placebo response. We have learned that there are things that can happen to people, tragedies that we call the dark night of the soul. We have learned that people who have used psychedelics, there's an excellent book written about this by Michael Pollan, and we've learned from people who have had things like near-death experiences that there can all be a variety of psychic phenomena present at these times. And what we think happens is that perhaps the default mode network, the boundaries of the ego, are broken down by, of course, the near-death experience would break any physical boundaries down, but broken down perhaps by the psychedelics, broken down by those who are gifted. They don't have the same kind of boundaries that many of the rest of us have. And then they're broken down by, geez, I think I have the world by the tail, and I don't have to think about a lot of things, and then all of a sudden my son dies, and I have to think about a lot of things. And I'm glad that I can think about a lot of things. I just wish it wouldn't have required that for me to do that. So anyway, what we think happens is that as the default mode network, or the ego, gets broken down, we move from the separateness of the ego into a sense of oneness, a sense of unity. So this is the kind of thing that may be happening when we start to look at things like out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Now, out-of-body experiences, these things can be replicated or caused by stimulation in certain areas of the brain that involve the hippocampus and the temporal lobe cells around the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is this, I have my model over here, but it's a little area adjacent to the amygdala near the temporal lobe, deep temporal lobe. And there are what are called place neurons in the hippocampus. And these place neurons are responsible for informing us of our place in the environment. Now, what's been found is that if these neurons can be stimulated, maybe by a seizure or maybe by use of electrodes, people can have a sense of floating away from their bodies. Their consciousnesses, they're dissociated. Now, they're not dissociated from their consciousness. Their consciousness is dissociated from their bodies, so that they have a sense of looking down on their body, except they don't have any eyes to look down on their body with. Their eyes are in their body where the stimulation has just taken place. Go figure. The other thing that happens with these folks that have had these kinds of experiences is that they have a sense of a cosmic unity. Their sense of these boundaries of their individuality, they lose that sense of their individuality. So, again, are we looking at breakdowns in the default mode network? Now, the study of near-death experiences will also involve the study of out-of-body experiences in just a second, but just looking at near-death experiences, this has been a study for, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But it was formalized in the West when Moody wrote his book in the 1970s called Life After Life. And out of that book has grown a huge study group of people called near-death experience researchers. And there's a number of them. And they all seem to be able to agree that there are 12 phenomena that are common to near-death experiences. Now, they're by no means universal to near-death experiences. Some happen more than others. Tunnels, lights, sense of peace, absence of pain, and sometimes out-of-body experiences. Now, there is another phenomenon that has been examined more recently, so that there are 13 commonalities of these people that have had near-death experiences. And the 13th one is the change in life. These people who have had these near-death experiences, they live life differently. This has been studied by someone a cardiologist named Pim van Lommel, Lommel, from the Netherlands. He describes where these people they repeat with great lucidity the same memory of their near-death experience from 1 year to the next, to 10 years out, to 20 years out. They are no longer religious. If they were religious before, they now tend to be more spiritual. They no longer have a fear of death. They are less anxious. These are the kinds of life changes that have happened to people with near-death experiences. Now, the out-of-body element of these near-death experiences allow us to study near-death experiences a little more thoroughly, because oftentimes, and up to 90% of the time, what happens during the out-of-body experience can be seconded by a person that was involved, like maybe a person was seen at a certain spot, or a conversation was overheard, or something was seen that could be found later. And about 90% of the time, these have been found to be accurate. Now, I know that there have been surgical procedures where they have put X's on certain machinery in the room. Now, there have been no reports of anybody with a near-death experience reporting that they saw the X in an out-of-body experience. But I am unaware of any reports that anybody with a near-death experience that experienced an out-of-body experience missed an X on a piece of machinery. So I think that that is it's not like everybody has a near-death experience, so it's not like we can study this very commonly. But I've heard physicalists use that as an argument that to minimize the near-death experience, but I think that they're reaching at this point. I've heard a number of biological attempts to explain away what happens during a near-death experience and an out-of-body experience, but none of them work, because all involve, what we've got with someone who's dying is that the brain is dying. The brain's not organized. The brain's not seeing things. The brain's not hearing things. And yet these people are coming back with these lucid, organized experiences. And there is really no physical explanation for probably the rarest of all phenomena regarding these near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, is that people who are deaf can hear. And there are reports of, at least one that I know of, a deaf person overhearing a conversation that was later confirmed by the people who had the conversation. And people who are blind can see. Now, how do you explain that from a physical standpoint? You got me. But it's an interesting place to leave off. I thank you very much for your attention and for being here. If you want, you can subscribe to my YouTube network. Ask any questions. I'll do my best to answer them. Please take care. Have a good day.